Lovely. So thank you very much for this last session of the day, but first session of the Impacting the Future strand at the Festival of the Creative Industries, third edition. I am really pleased to have with us Julian Friedmann, that Paolo will introduce, and Paolo Russo, that has been working within the Creative Industries Research and Innovation Network all the time with us. So thank you very much for being here. The title of the session is The Importance of Writers, Publishers and Broadcasters for a Democratic Society. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Paolo and Julian, for running this.
Thank you, Daniela. I will be very brief, but introductions are needed. And Julian Friedmann is first and foremost a literary agent. In 1982, correct me if I'm wrong, Julian, his own agency merged with the Carol Blake Literary Agency, and the Blake Friedmann Literary Agency was born in London. And they represent both book authors and media writers. And Julian is still the chairman of Blake Friedmann to this day. But let me say, defining Julian as just an agent would be rather simplistic. And over the years, Julian has been a keen and vocal contributor to many debates within and around the screen industries in particular, but both organizing and taking part in events, summits, and conferences. And today, it is my pleasure to introduce him to you on the opening day of our Creative Industries Festival, even more so because I have a vested interest, of course, in the topics he's going to cover in his talk: the importance of writers, publishers, and broadcasters for a democratic society. Julian, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paolo, and thank you to you and Maya for inviting me to talk, and thank you in the audience for being here. So, do we in Britain live in a democratic society? The obvious answer appears to be yes, but in many ways, we do not. The most recent attempt by the British government to manipulate voting was in last week's local council elections. Despite there being almost no voter fraud in British elections, the government deliberately disenfranchised some of the young, the homeless, the unemployed, or others who happen not to have an acceptable form of ID. These are people who coincidentally, traditionally do not vote Conservative. Britain is far, far less democratic than is commonly thought. Its first past the post electoral system means that not all votes have the same value, and a government can be, and frequently has been, voted in by a minority of votes cast. I once worked at a general election for the Liberal Party, and they got 1/6 of the vote, but only 1/60th of the seats. First past the post is not democratic. Consider Brexit, another example of a minority winning. But there are many other subversions of democracy, such as the subversion by controlling the truth, which is where writers, creatives, publishers, and broadcasters have such an important role. Let's just start now by reminding ourselves of the definition of the word democracy. Demos means the people, katos means power. Bit of background. I grew up in South Africa in the 1940s and 50s, the height of apartheid, and an unambiguous example of an undemocratic country. When I left for the UK in 1961, South Africa had no television, although it was available elsewhere in the world. This was because the apartheid government knew they could not allow the public, whether black or white, to see how the rest of the world lived. In South Africa in the 1960s, Anna Sewell's famous children's book, Black Beauty, was banned. So not only undemocratic, but also rather stupid. For generations, Catholic church leaders in Ireland hid the atrocities of the Magdalen laundries, the killing of illegitimate babies. They also, deliberately and knowingly, hid the sexual abuses perpetrated by Catholic priests. Politicians and the Irish government, fearful of alienating voters, were very slow to expose these abuses of power. Film, television, journalists, and storytellers did provide exposés, the movie Spotlight being a great example. Other movies that blew the whistle were Trumbo, dealing with screenwriters accused of un-American activity at the time of the Hollywood blacklist. Hidden Figures showed how the African-American women who were critically important to NASA during the space race had virtually been written out of history. In the UK, many, many years before those movies, a film called Cathy Come Home, for those of you old enough to remember it, changed the state of homelessness in the UK and led to the setting up of Shelter, the homeless charity. Publishers and broadcasters were the main gateways to the widest dissemination of information. But the web, the internet, has caught up, and for younger people today, the web is probably the dominant source of their information, and it's hopelessly unregulated, although paradoxically, it does offer optimum democratic access to anyone. Worryingly, the abuse of misinformation on the web is possibly the biggest challenge democracy will face in the coming years. But publishers and broadcasters do not offer open access to all, which means that it is ultimately up to activists to give us the truth and to take on the establishment. But unless they tell important stories in a way that successfully engages the hearts and minds of audiences, we will go on allowing mainstream politicians to overpromise, which means to lie, and to underdeliver, and effectively deny us true democracy. So how should people in the creative industries regard democracy? I believe we need to look at how writers can engage hearts and minds. To me, this is the ultimate challenge for storytellers. So the real power lies in how well you tell the stories. The broader public have many other ways of making political statements, from gluing themselves to railings or bridges, or as with Black Lives Matter, taking the knee. So without damning all politicians, or indeed all priests, I think we can safely assume they will not lead the way in championing democracies. How does a society know what is the truth? We're told we have a relatively free press. Given that is controlled by 4 or 5 press barons, almost all of them very right-wing, it's certainly not free from prejudice. I could list many other inequities, but the hard reality is that the press and the broad media, and I would sadly include the BBC to some extent, seem to be more concerned with supporting the so-called elite rather than exposing the truth. Just look at Fox News and Donald Trump for a very extreme example, against which you could show programs like World in Action on ITV and Panorama on the BBC, individual bright lights. Resistance, which can be joyful, will increasingly come from whistleblowers. Some newspapers have championed them. The hacking scandals of recent years, though, were caused by the right-wing press feeding the public's insatiable appetite for the squalid details of the private lives of celebrities. But if you have not seen the movie The Great Hack, I urge you to see it. The movie Don't Look Up is also interesting in its allegorical interpretation of our refusal to look at the truth about climate change. Climate change is another example of the truth being subverted. Fossil fuel companies, ExxonMobil in particular, have now admitted that they hid from their own scientists the truth about climate change, which was actually far worse than the public perception. And one can only assume it was because they wanted to be able to continue selling oil and coal, which made them gigantic profits. They have all succeeded in subverting the climate change campaign because their lobbies are so wealthy and so effective. From tobacco lobbies and sugar lobbies to fossil fuel lobbies, vested interests exert huge power. The full story of the fossil fuel lobby is brilliantly told in a 3-part BBC series called Big Oil versus the World, an example of a public service broadcaster doing its public service duty. What of the future? AI is going to be the battleground for the next 10 years. ChatGPT can give you a brilliant answer to almost any question you can ask, and it provides a great example of the value of technological change, but the changes are open to abuse. So I decided to ask ChatGPT the following question: how can writers fight against totalitarianism? Its answer was almost instant. It took about 10 seconds, and it's a great summary, which I'm going to read you. Writers have a powerful tool at their disposal to fight against totalitarianism: their words. Through their writing, writers can challenge oppressive systems, highlight injustices, and inspire resistance. Here are 4 ways in which writers can fight against totalitarianism. 1, speak truth to power. Writers can use their words to expose the lies and propaganda of totalitarian regimes. By telling the truth and shining a light on what is happening, writers can help counter the narratives that authoritarian leaders use to maintain their grip on power. 2, celebrate diversity and individuality. Totalitarian regimes often seek to erase individuality and promote conformity. Writers can fight back against this by celebrating diversity and championing the unique voices of individuals. By highlighting the richness of human experiences, writers can counter the monolithic narratives of totalitarianism. 3, challenge the status quo. Writers can use their imagination to envision alternative futures and challenge the oppressive status quo. By creating stories and narratives that inspire hope and resistance, writers can help to empower readers to take action and work towards a better world. And 4, document history. Totalitarian regimes often seek to erase or rewrite history to suit their own agendas. Writers can fight against this by documenting history and telling the stories of those who've been oppressed or silenced. By preserving the truth of what has happened, writers can help to ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. To get that in 10 seconds, I thought was pretty impressive. And I decided to just put it in there as an example of both what the subject of this talk is, but also of how AI is working. And it's there not because of what it says, but as an example of how it operates, and to illustrate that if it can be used for good, it can also be used for ill. I think you need to always try and understand your enemy if you wish to beat them. So those who feel some obligation to try and curb society's apparently natural tendency for government to maximize their control over the rest of us could do worse than go back to the sociologist Robert Michels and his iron law of oligarchy. He's best remembered today, I think, as the author of a book called Political Parties, a Sociological Study of the Oligarchic Tendencies of Modern Democracy. He believed that any large-scale organization, whether political party or democratically elected government, was going to be fundamentally incompatible with democracy. Inevitably, an oligarchy would develop, which would subvert the democratic will of the people. In Britain, you can see an example of this by the power exerted by the European Research Group, if ever there was a misnomer, the ERG, who have controlled the direction of the Conservative government for the past decade, who were the power behind Cameron and behind Johnson. I think they effectively put Johnson into number 10. Michel's iron law of oligarchy, in effect, says that if a politician stands in a democratic election on a particular platform, such as ending corruption, and the politician gets elected, that politician, in order to stay in power, will change his or her policies just in order to stay in power, even if it means becoming corrupt. I'm reminded of the Latin sentence, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, from the Roman poet Juvenal. Who guards the guards? You may vote someone into power. It doesn't mean they'll do the right thing or do what they promised to do to get your vote. So if opposition parties in a democracy cannot or will not hold the government of the day to account, who then? The internet and social media have been very abused, as we all know. Think of the Russian interference in American elections, which is now admitted to. They also interfered in British elections, although the British government has still not released the full Russian report. But it's not all doom and gloom, because the internet also has a democratizing effect. There are now new organizations that didn't really exist before. And the one I'd like to single out is the Good Law Project. They regularly take the government to court, and they usually win, which is extraordinary. They exist entirely funded by individual members of the public. They're not connected to any vested interests. And without the internet, they would find it impossible to raise finance. If you've not heard of them, I encourage you to check them out and try and support them. I think it's the most important pro-democratic development in Britain in the last 20 years. We desperately need voices to engage the public. We need resistance, which is why I believe that writers must be the conscience of humanity. Whether it's organizations like Amnesty International or PEN, which is the one specifically concerned with writers, or whether it's Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace, we need them all. We need journalists like Carol Cadwallader. We need whistleblowers like Julian Assange, or the people who leaked the Panama Papers. Even if you have reservations, and I do, about their methods, without whistleblowers, the amount of information we receive is severely limited. But there is, in my view, still too little risk-taking by writers, producers, broadcasters. Interestingly, it's worth looking at soaps, that rather downplayed area of television drama. They actually have quite a distinguished tradition of airing important issues. Recently, Coronation Street is to be commended for dealing with stalking and acid throwing. And the storyline makes the police look pretty bad for not taking a young woman's fears seriously enough. Their excuse in the drama was that the law did not allow them to do more. And you can bet that the people running Coronation Street checked this out very carefully. And I'm hoping that the exposure to millions of people in this country will lead to a change in the law. It is easy to point the finger, but really, do people need to be stalked, have acid thrown at them, raped or killed before politicians take action? We do need more heads above the parapet. We need more movies like Black Klansman and Trumbo and Spotlight. They're great, but they're not enough of them. The movie Blood Diamond wonderfully exposed illegal mining in Africa, but I suspect it didn't change the appalling conditions for the majority of the miners. I do accept that compared to my childhood in apartheid South Africa, Britain under Johnson and the Tories is a relatively democratic country. But actually, compared to an ideal, Britain is very undemocratic. That's the problem. We settle too easily for compromises. The image of one man facing the tanks in Tiananmen Square will live until the day I die in my mind. He was prepared to risk his life. Will you stand up to be counted? The West loves pointing the finger at nasty foreigners doing undemocratic things because it makes us believe that we're better and that what we're doing is okay. But we're only marginally better. there is massive room for improvement. When I look at our main political parties, at the press, at broadcasters, I don't think they're going to make significant improvements. There was an article in The Guardian in early May, 3rd of May, which raised the spectre of control of information. And I'm going to quote some paragraphs. The World Press Freedom Index, who knew there was such a thing, revealed a shocking slide with an unprecedented 31 countries deemed to be in a very serious situation, the lowest ranking in the report, up from just 21 countries 2 years ago. Increased aggressiveness from autocratic governments, and some that are considered democratic, coupled with massive disinformation or propaganda campaigns, has caused the situation to go from bad to worse, according to the list released by the advocacy group Reporters Without Borders. I think it's Rapporteur Sans Frontières, RSF. There is more red on the RSF map this year than ever before, as authoritarian leaders become increasingly bold in their attempts to stifle the press. The international community needs to wake up to reality and act together decisively and fast to reverse this dangerous trend. We've just had the 30th anniversary of the first World Press Freedom Day, which was created to remind governments of their duty to uphold freedom of expression. However, the environment for journalism today is considered bad in 7 out of 10 countries, satisfactory in only 3 out of 10. And the United Nations now says 85% of people in the world live in countries where media freedom has declined in the past 5 years. The survey assessed the state of the media in 180 countries and territories, looking at the ability of journalists to publish news in the public interest without interference and without threats to their own safety. It shows rapid technological advances are allowing governments and political actors to distort reality, and fake content is easier to publish now than ever before. The report goes on to say that artificial intelligence is wreaking further havoc on the media world, with AI tools digesting content and regurgitating it in the form of syntheses that flout the principles of rigor and reliability. This is not just written AI content, but visual too. High definition images that appear to show real people doing terrible things can be generated in seconds. At the same time, governments are increasingly fighting propaganda wars. Russia, which has already plummeted in the rankings last year after the invasion of Ukraine, dropped another 9 places as state media slavishly parrots the Kremlin line, while opposition outlets are driven into exile. And last month, as you may remember, Moscow arrested a Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan Gershkovich, the first American journalist detained in Russia on espionage charges since the end of the Cold War. So the question is, where will change come from? I believe that writers and actors can make a difference, which kind of begs the question, why don't they? Why aren't they? I think there are 2 reasons. The first is that, as I've discussed, the media is controlled by a small number of right-wing vested interests. The second is that teaching of script writing is, in my opinion, relatively poor, leading to unengaging dramas. There are always great exceptions you can hold up, like Sex Education, Killing Eve, Line of Duty, and so on. But there's deeper problems. I think we're not encouraging the right people to become scriptwriters. And I don't mean by that people of a particularly radical persuasion. The power to move audiences to change their ill-educated views through creative writing is simply not being well done. I read literally hundreds of scripts every year, probably close to 1,000. And I don't see really, really strong creative writing. At the moment, there's also, after COVID, a big change in appetite from producers, broadcasters, and publishers. They want feel-good programs. They want rom-com. They're not as keen on depicting the depressing reality of the increase in authoritarian governments. But I think these are knee-jerk reactions to a deepening crisis. Another useful, interesting resource is called the Little Black Book of Data and Democracy, which is about data harvesting, which is what the Great Hack was about. It's about surveillance advertising. It's about attempted coups. How did social media go from bringing us together to driving us apart? The Little Black Book is compiled by Kyle Taylor, and it's a deep dive into the dark world of big tech, describing the industry's destructive business model and detailing how you can fight back. What have people said about it? Shamir Thani, who was the Vote Leave whistleblower and activist, said, "I wish I'd had this little black book by my side when I blew the whistle." Caroline Lucas, Member of Parliament in the UK, said this book shows how as individuals, we are not helpless. We can fight back. And Jeff Orlovsky, director of the terrific movie, The Social Dilemma, said it took us 3 years to make a film to explain the complex issues distilled so expertly in this little black book. There are voices out there. We need to amplify them. The legacy of my generation, what kind of world my 12 grandchildren will inherit, is looking pretty grim. Some of them are very young, will face daily lives with temperatures close to 50 degrees centigrade. There will be ever increasing disparities between the haves and the have-nots. There will be economic apartheid. In fact, some people think there already is. And from the cozy comfort of our universities and colleges, we, and I'm afraid that includes some of you, are presiding over the disgraceful mismanagement of our planet. Publishing and broadcasting are essentially capitalist in nature. We cannot rely on them to show the way. They need persuading. They need to sell advertising or get ratings. They need audiences to keep them in existence. And that is where great writing comes in. Can you write a compelling drama or documentary which is so engaging that your subversive message, which the majority of the audience might not agree with, will nevertheless change their prejudiced minds? I think Don't Look Up was a great example to try and do that. Sadly, it was a really important story not told well enough to become a massive hit. To me, this is what we should be talking about. How do we write compelling stories with engaging characters that will change the world we live in, that will change the minds and hearts of the audience? I'm not saying it's easy, but if you were to start with Aristotle's Holy Trinity, pity, fear, and catharsis, you'd be starting in the right place. I accept the far right and the totalitarian sort of advocates can use the same writing techniques as the liberal left. Actually, they don't tend to. We've seen how Black Lives Matter changed the behavior of broadcasters. BBC and ITV now have a kind of 25% diversity rule in front of and behind the camera. They won't say it's a rule, but it is effectively so. And it's high time to redress the generations-old imbalance. But just putting a range of different races and disabilities in the cast of a drama is not enough. The stories must not preach to the converted. They must convert the preachers. Which brings me to my conclusion, which is a question I asked in a TEDx talk I gave nearly 10 years ago and nearly 1 million views later. And that there is a mystery, which is why so many people want to write, but in truth, they write so badly. I'm not going to go into all the reasons for this. The talk does that, but some of the reasons include who is selected to be trained. Very few degree courses need proof of talent before they'll take the fees scriptwriting students are willing to pay. Too little understanding of the right brain, left brain issue exists in the teaching of writing. Dominant right brain writers are much more creative. than dominant left brain writers. But most of the teaching of script writing is done by deconstructing the structure of a film or of a drama, something that right brain writers really struggle with, and the less creative left brainers get very easily. So we're selecting the wrong students. Another reason is, I think, poor connections between academics and the film and television industries. When I set up the MA in television scriptwriting at De Montfort University, we had the highest number of industry lecturers of any postgraduate degree course, and we had the fewest academics. And we quickly started losing students who got work in the industry and therefore didn't finish their degree. They'd signed up to the degree in order to get work in the industry. They got the work, so they didn't finish the degree. The university absolutely hated that, despite the fact that I pointed out it was the greatest accolade that could be paid to the course. Academics have a golden chance to create revolutionaries amongst their students, but access to obtain work as writers in film and television and theatre is really hard. Self-publishing can be a game changer for prose writers, as of course is the internet. I can only hope that more academics will become more radical and that they will inspire students to demand the truth in their creative endeavors. And God knows it as we move into irreversible climate change for millions, as sea levels inexorably rise, and I'm not exaggerating. The pen should be mightier than the sword, but actually there isn't a level playing field when it comes to access to the media, which is why it's more important than ever for writers and for those who work with them to take a stand, to call out discrimination, exploitation, and abuse, whatever risk-taking that involved. The so-called creative industries, in my opinion, are falling far short. I get it that in order to be an industry, you have to be economically viable. And in order to be economically viable, you have to make compromises. Arts funding in Britain, after a decade or more of reactionary conservative governments, has fallen off a cliff. So we're back to the question of who guards the guardians. And the only answer I know is that we need activists, especially writers who are activists, more than ever. It's up to all of us to inspire the next generation to be more vigilant, more progressive, more democratic than the generations that preceded them. Because history is going to look back on my generation and the one before it and the one that's going to follow, and we will be seen to have failed future generations. Come back, Aristotle, all is forgiven. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much. I will kick off because I would like to ask Julian one question too, that actually picks up on some of the things you touched upon. And as you know, I feel very strongly about pretty much everything you said, but in particular about that sort of misconception or misperceived chasm between engagement and entertainment. And because, of course, you said that we need activist writers and we need to talk about, we need stories that actually sort of show the truth to audiences, but we need to do this in the proper way. We need to actually come up with creative ideas that are entertaining, which basically means convincing producers and networks that might be hesitant to pick up stories that revolve around these issues. Can we sort of elaborate a little bit more on that? I know that there aren't any ready-made recipes, but can we elaborate on this particular topic a little bit?
It's a huge topic, and it's a very interesting one. I mean, you need to I think distinguish between the different audiences. So the people who go to the cinema are not necessarily the same people who watch television. I mean, one of the fascinating statistics I was told is that the average age of a BBC television drama viewer is 57 years old, which is kind of worrying in a way, because the future is not for 57-year-olds. It's for much younger people. And the truth is that the majority of the public are more interested in being entertained than in being educated. And the difficulty is if you have a message, I think it was Sam Goldwyn who said in critiquing someone's script in Hollywood many, many years ago, if you want to send a message, go to Western Union. If you want to send a message, you've kind of got to hide it to some extent. You know, I don't know what the box office for Black Klansman was. I thought it was a remarkably good film, but I don't think it had a huge audience. It should have, in my view. And it wasn't because Spike Lee didn't tell it well. It was basically because the majority of the public are really interested in popcorn movies, you know, not in serious films. The number of people who watch serious documentaries is pitifully small. And that means if you are trying to change the world, whether you're a green campaigner or a race campaigner or a campaigning against misogyny, it takes someone like Sarah Everard being killed by a serving police officer to raise public consciousness. So you need something as massive and as horrendous as that. The value of entertainment as a way of changing people's thinking is much more subtle. I mean, look at George Orwell's 1984. You know, kids are given the book to read and they're told it's really about bullies and democracy and so on, which is, which is good. But the reality is that it's not the most popular book that most children at school read. They read a lot of, I think children should read whatever they read. It's better than not reading. So I don't want to be prescriptive, but it's quite difficult to give a message and entertain. But I think it's something that people should be encouraged to do.
Was just checking Box Office Mojo for Black Klansman. I think it got about 100 million. So it's not bad for that.
That's not bad. Film. That's not bad.
Because I think it's 10 times the budget. So for a Spike Lee's movie to come back with that is not bad.
Oh, for him, it's good. Yeah. But, then you look at what Avatar.
Yeah, of course. There's no comparison.
Thanks. I hope you can hear me. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's really, really fascinating. Some really great insights there. I was just interested to know, you mentioned that screenwriting is something that perhaps isn't taught as well as it could be, and that perhaps the right people aren't selected to do that. I'm just interested to know more of your thoughts on what could be done with that, and whether you think actually it goes beyond higher education, whether screenwriting and related disciplines should be taught in schools, for example.
Actually, that raises a really interesting question. Many years ago, I can't remember which group I was working with, but we tried to take a kind of campaign to both the Minister of Culture and the Minister of Education to get scripts from movies that kids loved put on the reading list, so that children of 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever, could read the script of Finding Nemo, because we know from parents who had kids of that age, and that they actually were given the scripts and they enjoy reading them. And we don't have a very script literate population. We have a very film literate population. But I think that education of visual media and plays as well. So if you look at a school curriculum, you'll see Shakespeare, you'll see, Chaucer, you'll see a whole lot of very distinguished literary playwrights. But you don't tend to see very contemporary material. I'm not sure that the script for Stickman or, those kind of, or even The Snowman, which was hugely successful children's animation. I'm not sure the script for that would be very readable, but I think in the 1980s and 90s, maybe even the early 2000s, if you weren't sure what you wanted to do at university, amongst the most popular courses were media studies. And media studies were kind of soft sociology. I think they were actually quite interesting, but they didn't lead anywhere. There wasn't a kind of obvious career path. And they became derided. And, if you said in a group of peers, oh, I'm doing media studies, people would look at you as though, what you mean, you couldn't think of anything more useful or serious to do. And media studies started going out of fashion, and somehow script writing suddenly became incredibly fashionable. I published Britain's only script writing magazine in the early part of this century, and there were courses popping up everywhere. And I was even asked to be an external examiner to decide whether a course at a university, I think it was Brunel, should be allowed to happen. And both I and the other external examiner, who was far better qualified than I was, said no, because their list of prescribed books, there was not a single book there that wasn't 15 years old or more. There was no index, no way of judging whether the people they took on could write or not. In other words, if you applied to do the course, you didn't have to write anything. It's not difficult to say to a student who comes in for an interview, go to that desk and I want you to write 2 pages of dialogue. And if you're serious about being a scriptwriter and you can't respond to that, well, I'm sorry, I don't think you're serious about being a scriptwriter. And when I used to do a lot of teaching, I would walk into the room, and after the introduction, I'd say, okay, how many of you read or have read 25 scripts a year? And there'd be a fair number of hands would go up. So, well, how many of you have read 50 scripts a year? And it would start dropping dramatically. And I say, how many of you have read 100 scripts a year? And the only people who ever put their hands up were people who were already working as script readers, i.e. they had part-time jobs. And I would look at the group and I would say, I'm very po-faced, this was quite sort of silly of me, really. I'm not sure that I'm going to teach this class because I'm wasting my time. You want to be script writers and you can't be bothered to read 2 scripts a week. It takes 90 minutes max to read a script. That's 3 hours. You can't be bothered to read 2 scripts. Oh, but I see 2 or 3 movies every week. Sorry, going to the movies, it doesn't teach you to be a scriptwriter. When you see a movie, it's gone through multiple other creative hands. It's changed in ways you couldn't possibly recognize. Again, I'm really old. I don't know how many of you remember a movie called 4 Weddings and a Funeral. It was a small Channel 4 movie. It was meant to be a TV movie. It was so kind of small that the coterie of lovies who acted in it and who put it together basically didn't pay themselves anything except for the American actress whose agent said, no, she's got to get 2% of the budget. And the movie was an absolute huge success. It just blew everybody away. And every agent I knew at the time started getting phone calls from producers saying, have you got anything like 4 Weddings and a Funeral? To which the correct answer was, if we did, you wouldn't recognize it because it went through 17 major rewrites. So education does have a much bigger role to play than it does. But I think, there isn't a film industry in Britain. An industry means somewhere where there is work to be had, where you can go and get a job and you can build a career. There is an industry for television writers. But if you ask 100 students who want to be screenwriters, how many of you want to write for TV? which means writing soaps, and how many of you want to write movies, you'll probably get 85% movies and 15% TV and soaps. So the people who want to become screenwriters aren't necessarily the right people. And I have serious doubts about the teaching of script writing. I'm not sure it's something that can be taught in the way that you can learn French or mathematics. It requires a kind of talent which is not teachable. And I don't know how to deal with that other than just to call it out. Polly, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a really interesting subject. Again, one I'm happy to talk about for another hour.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Maya in the chat, and then after Maya, we have a question from Osifo who raised the hand. So Osifo, just hold on for a second. I wanted to ask about polarizing conceptualizations of audiences and how they might hinder genuine dialogue and create new hierarchies of communications. For instance, writers are always educators, audience is always in need to be educated.
I'm not entirely sure I get the question. To me, it's a very academic approach to looking at the end of it was, are the audiences there to be educated, and are the writers the educated? You know, the interesting thing is that if you are teaching 18 to 25-year-old students creative writing or script writing, I don't think they're as well educated as 50-year-old people who go to their local multiplex every week, because they will have seen many, many more movies than the students. So in one sense, they have a almost innate understanding of movie storytelling. It doesn't mean they could write one in a million years. But I think that the problem I've always found in classrooms where discussion about us and them, audience, writers, creators, and the audience, is there is a polarization. I think it's also kind of rather egotistical. It's as though we are us, the creators, are more superior. You know, George Orwell wrote a lovely book, which I would recommend, called Why I Write. And it was his distillation of the knowledge he gained from talking to writers. And he gave, I think, 4 reasons. He said, the 4 main reasons why people write are, in no particular order: 1, to get back at people who put you down; 2, to make the world a better place; 3, to, oh, now I've forgotten the 3rd one. Oh, this is really bad to start telling a story and not finish it. But essentially, he said the biggest one, the main one, the one that drove most writers, was sheer egotism. So I'm always very skeptical of the motivation of writers in this sense. I believe that one of the best reasons for writing, and I'm not the person who most famously said this by any means, was Dr. Johnson, is to make money. It's a very good way of making money if you have the talent. You know, you can write a novel, you can write a play, you can write a movie script, and then it then goes into the world and does what it does, and you can then write another one. You don't run out of ideas. You know, it's I think a very appealing career. However, a lot of people who write for complex reasons, which are an amalgam of George Orwell's list. And I think if writers don't understand why they're writing, what the purpose of their endeavors is, then I think there's a danger that they will assume a kind of superiority which will lead to a polarization between themselves and the audience. And the interesting thing about Aristotle is that he deconstructed, you know, Athenian stage plays 2,500 years ago. And he deconstructed it down to 3 words: pity, fear, and catharsis. And what he meant by those 3 words were that you needed the audience to feel pity or empathy for a character. In order to identify with that character, the writer has to be quite clever and ensure that the audience emotionally connects. So, for example, a young mother is pushing her baby across a park, and 2 guys rush up, knock her to the ground, take the pram and the baby. The audience is immediately going to feel a huge wave of sympathy, empathy, pity for that woman. Aristotle then went on to say that the writer then needs to create a sense of fear in the audience by creating more jeopardy for the woman whose child has just been stolen. And the greater the level of jeopardy, the greater the fear that will be felt by the audience. And then when the baby is rescued and reunited with its mother, the audience feels a huge swelling of happiness, of feel-good, of joy. So what he was saying is that good writing causes emotional reactions in the audience. You have to get the audience to identify with the character. You have to make the character suffer. You then have to relieve the character of their suffering. And insofar as there is a formula for good writing, that's it. But it's so simplistic that it's not really a formula. However, I think it works. I think it's always worked. I think it always will work. And I think that the ability to connect emotionally between a character and a member of the audience is the gold dust and is very difficult to do. There is now quite a lot of literature about this. When I wrote my book on screenwriting 25 years ago, I looked up 100 books on screenwriting, playwriting, and so on, and I looked in the index for the word emotion. I found it in 3 books. Today, thankfully, there are whole books devoted to the subject. But I think this is really the key to good writing and to the manipulation of the audience in a healthy and holistic way.
Okay, so next up, we have Usifo raised. Sorry, did I pronounce your name correctly? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, you're correct. You're correct.
Okay, thank you.
First of all, thank you all so much for this fantastic presentation. I'm from Sierra Leone in West Africa, and I am a traditional storyteller. So I use oral storytelling. I use my traditional folk stories to tell. And I think our guest had just mentioned something about why we write or why we deliver what we do. And I think that's a very important point, because I found myself, because it's not so much a question I have, what hopefully I'm contributing, maybe throwing a little bit more, open it a little more to the area of oral literature. Because I do think that most times oral literature is tend to be put aside. But I found that in my work as a storyteller, I am affecting a lot of change, at least within my country and many of the other countries I've traveled around the world, in helping and changing or developing people's perspective in looking at African culture, or just generally whether it is to do with diversity, which again I think the speaker mentioned about how we appreciate diversity. I found that within my stories that I found in my village that were told to me even when I was a child, within these stories, there are precious messages that now that I am, I have a background training in theater. And so I'm using all of those skills to kind of like, unpack these stories. And I've found effective ways now to use these stories to kind of advocate a lot of what our speaker have just been talking about, whether it is addressing political issues or on democracy, or whether it's about effective social change or sometimes cultural awakening. And I just wonder what would be the speaker's take on oral literature in this case.
Sifu, I think you raise a really interesting question. I mean, it's a kind of conventional wisdom that in Western Europe, the Gypsies and the Irish are the best oral storytellers. And I think many of them make wonderful writers. There's a very interesting anecdote. So many, many years ago, I was studying under a wonderful guy called Frank Daniel, and we were discussing the kind of genesis of storytelling. And one of I was involved in various European Union media programs, ARVI, which is producer training one. I ran one for developing TV series. And in one of these, someone said to him, before Aristotle and before Sid Field and before Robert McKee, how did great storytellers know how to tell stories? Because as far as we know, they're told in a particular way, which is exemplified by people like Sid Field and Robert McKee. And he said that if you go back to, and this is a hypothesis because obviously there are no records, but if you go back to, 30, 40,000 years ago, to pre-literate societies before there was conventional writing, and you would have a village or a clan sitting around the campfire at night, and you'd have the elders telling stories to try and bind the clan together, to try and establish what their rules were. And these were very often not rules as in what Parliament lays down for us, but they would be narrative stories about, mysterious creatures or whatever. I think that is one of the most interesting subjects to study is the genesis of language. How did language start? Because once language started, you get storytelling. How do you make that transition? I don't know what the answer is to that. I did try and study it. I did a module in university on where we looked at the kind of it was called linguistic relativity, which I thought was absolutely fascinating and gripping until my tutor told me that I was 10 years too late. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh, forget about it. It's now totally out of the window. No one takes it seriously anymore." And I said, "But I still think it makes a lot of sense." He said, "Well, you won't get very good marks in your essays if you keep saying that." I think, the thing about oral storytelling, the best example in my life is my grandchildren. I go to their birthday parties. At their birthday parties, there will be a clown, usually. And at some point, the clown will gather all the children around him. They'll have to sit down cross-legged, and he will tell them a story. Now, a number of things happen. I've watched this with great fascination. Firstly, his face is very mobile. He moves around. He also, and given that Paolo is Italian, and Daniela may be Italian too, he also uses his hands the way Italians do, very expressively. And someone once told me that if you want to be good at pitching a story to a producer, you have to pitch it as if you're Italian. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you have to be very mobile and you have to use your hands." And I said, "Why is that so important?" And he looked at me as I was really stupid and said, "While you're occupying their ears with your words, you have to occupy their eyes, give them something to look at, not you sitting like a statue, because it's very boring. And actually, it's much more difficult to take in information if the speaker is completely passive and just like this. So actually, if you really want to be effective as a lecturer, you should be standing up, moving around, not sitting down. But I think you make an interesting point, and I think that oral storytellers have a natural way of engaging. However, you are doing it effectively using kind of dialogue. I mean, you are talking, you know, in a screenplay or even in a stage play, you do have to move the furniture around, or you have to have, you know, what was that lovely phrase from Shakespeare? Exeunt chased by a bear. You know, you've got to actually have the visuals as well. I don't know how important that is in your particular form of oral storytelling, but I think it certainly raises the point is that you've got to be entertaining, whatever you're doing if you're a storyteller. However, whichever form you use, you have to entertain. And actually, if you're a good oral storyteller, it's a lot easier than putting words on paper.
Sadeh Fadipe, she is actually sharing her experience of self-publishing that, Julian, you touched upon. And she said, well, first of all, she thanks you for this timely conversation. And she's a children's author who felt compelled to write a war story, citing possible reasons for displacement and why children might show up at their schools due to displacement. So her publisher was not willing to commission it, so she went on and she went ahead and self-published. Now, during the pandemic, they took to reading the story in diverse voices online. They had to live performances. And she says, when we have dramatized this story, the children have been truly moved and engaged, and such powerful scenes have opened doors to further conversations around the trauma that these children may have, sorry, I'm reading, it's very tiny, faced. And however, our one-on-one low-level access to audiences slows down the missions or shows the mission I feel inspired, and she feels inspired to act on. So basically, she wanted to share this experience of self-publishing.
Great, good.
We close with one question from Lana. So I don't know if she's asking you or she's saying that, would say that current scripts and storylines, both in movies and TV dramas, are overly woke, either overly woke or not woke enough? And how do we find a balance between the two?
I don't know that there is a balance. Firstly, you have to look at how stories generally are written for cinema or television. There's usually some kind of pitch document or outline. Then it goes to a longer treatment. Then it goes to maybe a step outline, which is kind of scene by scene without the dialogue. And then it goes to a script with the dialogue. In my experience, that's not enough stages. And the result is that most scripts are presented to people in the industry, which includes to agents, several drafts too early, and so they get rejected. I mean, we have a kind of saying in our office, which is, if we get a script or a manuscript, which is an absolutely fabulous idea, but it's really badly written, we just reject it immediately. If we get a project which is not a great idea, but the writing is beautiful, we'll look more carefully at it. Because ideas are 10 a penny. We give ideas to clients. I mean, it's a bit of a cheat because we talk to publishers and producers all the time. They tell us what they're looking for. We feed that information back. And what we're really looking for, and what people in the industry are really looking for, is great writing. Great writing doesn't necessarily mean you come up with the right idea at the right time. It just means you have a way with words. I mean, my mother, who was a bit of a writer, I was talking to her about it one day and said, so what exactly, when you write, what are you doing? And she said, I'm just trying to find the right word to follow the word before it, which kind of went over my head at the time, but it's kind of quite true. And I think that the lack of depth of character is a major problem in scripts and in novels. how do you get that depth? How do you get characters to be really interesting? Now, there are tons of books. There's thousands of books on it. I mean, I guess the most obvious is you need to be able to depict the character in a way that the reader will identify with that character. Even if they're the villain, you need to identify with the villain, not just with the antagonist as well as the protagonist. Depth of character comes in many ways. Partly it comes from the dialogue they use. Partly it comes from the fact that you have a robust psychological understanding of who they are as people. If you have a husband or a wife or a mother or a father or a brother or a sister, you could probably sit down with someone and describe their personality and the psychology of what makes them who they are in great detail. You could probably talk for an hour quite easily. Very few writers can ever do that about their characters because they don't work hard enough. They don't push that hard enough. So I think that one of the ways of, if you like, getting the balance, or what I would rather say was getting a script or a manuscript to a point that someone reads it and says, I love this, is to do a very deep dive into the personality and the psychology of the character. And there was a great trick to do this, which is, imagine you are the antagonist or the protagonist of your story, and you go to a psychiatrist, you lie on their couch, and you're going to tell them the story of your novel or of your screenplay from their point of view. So you talk as if you are the character, and you describe how you relate to all the other characters in it. And you do this in a kind of free way. It's just like verbal diarrhea. You just let it all out. So you sit at your keyboard and you just type furiously for an hour or 2 hours. I once had one client give me 70 pages of stream of consciousness, of which I should say probably 70% was absolute garbage. But when we looked at the other 30%, the writer said to me, I don't know where that came from. And the other 30% was full of absolutely fascinating, interesting characters. Suddenly, this character had a real personality and 3 dimensions, almost 4 dimensions. So you need to dig deep into your characters before you start writing the script. You shouldn't write the script until you've done 70, 80% of the work on the story. You need to know all that stuff before you start. And I can guarantee you that 90% of writers start writing much too early. So they never find the balance. They never get to the point where their work is outstanding. If writing were easy, we'd all be doing it and making money out of it. We're all trying to do it, but very few people make money out of it. So it's not easy. And I don't think you can actually write, you know that thing they give children called paint by numbers. We have all the outlines and the number 27 is red, and you get the red and you fill in the bit. That's how too much writing is done. And, someone once said, but, look, I've done a BA, an undergraduate degree in script, I've done an MA in script writing, I've done work placements, I've done this, and no one wants my work. And I said, well, maybe you haven't got any talent. And they were quite upset. Now, my view is, if I can stop that person wasting the next 10 years of their lives and a lot of money and failing to have a career, I think I'm doing them a favor. I don't think there's a kind of magic bullet at all. So, why do you want to tell stories? What is it about storytelling? And there's anecdotally, I often hear people say of someone, oh, even when 6-year-old, they were writing stories. Anecdotally, we hear that Steven Spielberg was schlepping around a big, a sort of 8mm camera he could barely pick up when he was a child. Clearly, someone like Steven Spielberg does have an incredible instinct and talent for storytelling. I think the problem is that, and I know some of you teach script writing, I think the problem is that if you want to be a scriptwriter, you shouldn't be studying how to be a scriptwriter. You should be doing a degree in psychology. You know, you need to understand human nature. 18-year-olds do not, generally speaking, understand enough about human nature to be able to refract their knowledge into a bunch of characters in a narrative that's going to be interesting to anyone else except 15-year-olds. So I think there's a lot of reasons why a lot of people do degree courses and never get any work, never get published, or never get published in a way that they feel is successful. You know, because it's not something which everybody is entitled to expect to be able to do. You need talent. You know, I can't paint to save my life. I mean, I can paint a wall. I'm quite good at painting a wall, but I can't paint portraits. And I would never expect, however much I might want to, and I watch Portrait Artist of the Year with great fascination and deep awe for the ability of these people to capture something almost ephemeral in the face of a well-known person. I wouldn't be as arrogant to say that, you know, if I go and do a degree in fine art, I should be able to be a portrait painter. I think it's nuts. And I think a lot of people trying to be scriptwriters should not be being scriptwriters. If they love the movies, there's lots of other work in the movies that they could probably do really well. So I think, you know, there are some really deep issues in this. And I'll just give you one more example. A company that did dubbing and subtitling came up with a statistic that the average American movie has only 2/3 of the dialogue of the average European movie. It takes 600 subtitles to subtitle an American movie. It takes 1,000 subtitles to subtitle a European movie. And if you then try and deconstruct even further, the length of scene in American movies is approximately half the length of scene in a European movie. So what does that mean in terms of engaging the audience? If you have long, slow scenes, the audience's mind is going to wander. They're going to think, did I get something out of the freezer for dinner? I must remember to put the rubbish out. If you put all your scenes in a row and you cut the beginning and the end of every scene out, you leave a gap. What does the audience do? It fills in the gap. Audiences are very sophisticated at watching movies. You don't need to spell it all out. And when you make the audience lean forward and participate in the watching of your movie and fill in those gaps, they feel good. So they come out of the movie having had a better time. If you then jump across the Atlantic, there was a period when movies were silent. Now, the people who ran the nascent movie studios more than 100 years ago were European Jews who'd fled Europe and had come to America. And what do European Jews do when they migrate? They try and set up businesses. And they would be quite successful. And then talkies came in and they realized they had a problem. If you look at the demographic makeup of America 100 plus years ago, very, very large proportion of the people were immigrants who did not speak English. And therefore they would not be able to follow the first talking movies. So movie scenes were very short. The storytelling was very visual. And compared to Europe, we had 2,500 years, 3,500 years of stage plays and radio drama. We were totally dialogue locked in. We told stories through dialogue. We didn't tell stories through moving images. If you look at the difference between comic books in America in the last century and in Europe, comic books were predominantly for adults, and they were predominantly French and Belgian. In America, you had Superman and all sorts of wham bam stuff. They were storyboards. I grew up in South Africa, which was very much like a corner of Texas that culture had somehow missed entirely. And my mother used to give me classic comics. She used to give me Shakespeare and classic comics because no way my teachers were getting me to read Shakespeare. They didn't even try. So American kids have grown up on visual storyboards. They don't have to think about minimizing dialogue. It comes naturally to them. Whereas we come from a tradition of great dialogue. I mean, go back to Shakespeare, best dialogue writer ever. Well, David Mamet's pretty good. But there are a whole lot of things in our culture that have mitigated, I think, against our being, I'm going to use a word which gets frowned on, being commercially successful film screenwriters. Someone said to me, try and watch when you're on a plane, watch an American movie, but turn the sound off for 10 minutes, and then choose a European movie and turn the sound off. The difference is stark. You can pretty well follow quite a lot of it. I mean, you can't if it's David Mamet or Woody Allen, but if it's a kind of popcorn movie, you can follow it if it's an American movie. So we're struggling against our cultural heritage to some extent. And I think that means we tend, and also I have to say, I think the British film, the BFI now is in a different place, but for a long time, the subsidy money available to writers and filmmakers was very culturally oriented. If you wanted to make a worthy film, you got money, you got support. If you wanted to make a very commercial film, you didn't. I had a client who had a fabulous, incredibly commercial idea, Scottish writer, went to Scotland. It wasn't Scottish Screen as is now, it was the people before that. And they said, this is absolutely wonderful, but we won't give you any money because you can go and get it from sales companies and distributors will give you the money. We're not going to use our money on a commercial film. When they should have been grabbing him with both hands and saying, great, we want hugely successful Scottish movies. So I think there's a lot of cultural sort of baggage being dragged along, which is dragging us down. Someone once said, a movie which can be described as a niche movie is a movie being written for no audience. It's a bit like people talk about broadcasting and narrowcasting. The fact is, Netflix and Amazon and some of the other streamers have done something which no one else was able to do in Britain and in America, which is to get pig-ignorant, English-speaking, arrogant English-speaking people who think they controlled empires and so on, to watch movies in foreign languages. You couldn't get an audience. I mean, the Curzon would have, 27 people watching, an Eastern European movie. Now, they're seen by millions of people. It's great. It's one of the great democratizing things about the streamers. I can remember when a German soap was bought by Channel 4 and they tried it dubbed, audience hated it. So they had to do it, show it subtitled. If you're a kid in Europe, you watch English movies with English dialogue. You watch German movies, German dialogue. You learn languages by watching movies. It's one of the great things about Europe that we somehow failed, even when we were in the European Union, to benefit from. I'm sorry, I don't know if that is an answer to your question.
Checking if Sadez, maybe.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, it's food for thought. I'm scheduled to attend a scriptwriters meeting before the end of the month, and we're going to sit down with the producer and just get, I think your advice about actually finding out about the character first before we start even dreaming about writing the script is very valuable. We need to know what where the producer is going with her idea and her story before we can even sit down and start writing. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
I'll just add one thing. I think it was Robert McKee. I heard Robert McKee say this, although I've heard it from other people, that plot comes out of character. What happens because of who the characters are. And most writers do it the other way around. They think of the plot, they think of the everything that has to happen for the plot to unfold, and then somehow they add characters, but the plot isn't actually coming out of who the characters are. In fact, I think McKee said plot is character and character is plot. That's his typical way of trying to kind of make it sound fun. But it is, I think, one of the great problems that, I mean, I love action movies, and I have to say most action movies have very poor and thinly developed characters. But every now and then you come across one that does have good characters, and it's a great treat. And I get it, it's like horror movies. I mean, you don't ever really go to, except, I mean, Silence of the Lambs, but that was firstly based on a really clever novel. But, the average low-budget horror movie has characters who are barely two-dimensional. But then, in a way, you could argue they don't need to be, because the 15 to 25-year-old audience that loves those movies and sees them online doesn't really care. They just want to see people being eviscerated by Freddy Krueger. But the truth is, if you can't write decent characters, and if you don't understand why people behave they do, there's a good book I would recommend called The Art of Creative Writing by a man called Egri, E-G-R-I. I don't recommend his earlier book, which is essentially about stage play writing. And annoyingly, it's called The Art of Dramatic Writing. But The Art of Dramatic Writing has the world's best subtitle. So the book is called The Art of Dramatic Writing, and its use in the understanding of human motivation. That's all writers need to be able to do, understand why people behave the way they do.
Okay, listen, Julian, I would go on forever to listen to you, and as you know, but I think we can wrap up on that note. So I'm just going to thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you very much to our audience.
Julian, I'm annoyed that we didn't book a 6-hour session with you. That's what it is now, and I'll leave my frustration here. But I think you need to promise to come back with us, because I think that you touched on so many aspects that I'm sure that the audience would want to come back to. And of course, you started from Ken Loach all the way to the Good Law Project. You sort of touched all my heroes. So there you go. Thank you very, very much.
Very sweet, very kind of you. I mean, just a little plug. I do have some books available, which basically are much more long-winded than my talk. And there's always, if you haven't heard my TEDx talk, I'd appreciate it, because I'm very keen to get to 1 million views. I'm about 980,000. Okay, thank you, guys. Thanks for the very, very, really, really interesting questions. I really appreciate those.
Thank you. And thank you, Paolo, for organizing this.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. And always a pleasure to do these sort of events. And thank you, Julian, once again for being with us today. And thank you very much to the audience as well for the questions and for being here.